You're listening to Fire Ecology Chats, a podcast series by the Association for Fire Ecology.
Hello, fellow fire ecologists and listeners. Welcome to another edition of Fire Ecology Chats. My name is Bob Keane, and Fire Ecology Chats is where we discuss a paper that has been currently published in the journal Fire Ecology. Fire Ecology is a journal that's published by Springer and then overseen by the Association for Fire Ecology. Today, we got a wicked cool paper, and it's a paper that only you'll see in the journal Fire Ecology. The name of the paper is Bark Traits and Fire Vulnerability in 3 California Foothill Oak Species. And today we have Kaili to talk with us. Kaili, can you introduce yourself?
Yeah, thank you. So I'm Kaili Brande. I'm a postdoctoral research associate at the University of Oregon and would describe myself generally as a landscape, forest, and fire ecologist. So this work specifically came out of my PhD research at UC Santa Barbara.
Well, welcome to the chats, Kaili. I got to tell you, I love these kind of papers. To me, the paper that you published is a stepping stone to learning more and more about fire ecology. So could you tell us a little about the paper?
Yeah, so in our study, we basically looked at different ways that bark could provide protection from fire for 3 different oak species that are widespread throughout California and in the West. But we combined both field experiments and model predictions to figure out basically which characteristics of tree bark actually confer the fire adaptation or the protection.
Were there any impetus behind doing this paper? I mean, why did you pick this study to go ahead and do?
Yeah, so I think for one, oaks are, as many of us know, a very widespread and important genus in many different fire-prone ecosystems throughout the world. And they're very culturally and ecologically significant. But given there's an increased risk of wildfire in many of these systems where they live, we felt it would be important to identify more quantitative ways to assess fire risk for these species, specifically based on bark as a functional trait. There has been quite a bit of documentation of how oaks are considered fire resistant. For example, they have a strong ability to resprout post-fire or post-disturbance, and they are generally known to have protective bark, which is important for fire survival, but many of the finer details has not been well documented for oak species. And so there are mortality, or more specifically, trunk tissue mortality from fire, but most of these models have been predominantly tested on conifer species and rarely on oak or similar hardwood species. So it would be really important to look at kind of how these models do for these species and what's really happening for oaks.
Really like the methods. Could you give us a little summary about what the methods you used?
Yeah, so we had a combination of a bunch of different methods. So for field measurements, we went out and took bark samples in the field, so measuring thickness, moisture content, and density from live trees. And we also completed bark heating experiments in the field, so using a heat source on the bark and recording the time it took for the inner trunk tissues to reach lethal temperatures, which this amounts to a metric called time to cambium kill, which is basically a metric of tree vulnerability to fire-induced tissue death. And so we compared which of those traits is most influencing that time to cambium kill. We also predicted time to cambium kill based on using existing models and compared that to our field measurements. And then finally, as another sort of quality of bark, we looked at the allometric growth pattern. So how does the bark grow over the lifespan of the tree? And also how does it grow across the height?
Very cool. Such a great thing. Maybe we could ask you to give us a little sneak peek of the results. What did you find?
Yeah, so I would say generally based on the time to cambium kill measurements and the allometric growth patterns, we found that Quercus agrifolia, or the coast live oak, demonstrated greater evidence of fire adaptation, just more broadly compared to the other 2 white oaks in the study. And we did find that the predictions from the models compared to our field measurements, they performed modestly, but we generally felt like more work would be helpful to develop and refine better models that better work for oak species.
Very nice. I found it really interesting because I'm a modeler and I take your results and put it right in my models. It was very nice. So how are people going to use your results in management and in science?
Yeah, so I think more broadly, this study provides sort of a trait-based framework for quantifying fire adaptation based on bark traits specifically. And the importance of this is most previous studies have quantified fire adaptation based on resprouting rates or the numbers of trees surviving in wildfires, but not on, the existing qualities of bark in more of a physiological sense. But I think maybe a stronger takeaway in the short term is based on time to cambium kill measurements, we identified these safe thresholds thresholds at which a tree's trunk diameter or bark thickness would be relatively safe from fire, meaning it was protected enough to avoid trunk tissue death when a fire does pass through. And so this is like, at this centimeter diameter or at this thickness of bark, this species is going to be fine. And so this could be helpful to land managers that have oak species of different sizes on their property to help recognize maybe which are more or less vulnerable in a wildfire or even in a prescribed fire. And so, say in a prescribed fire, the land manager could focus efforts on protecting those more vulnerable trees with brush clearing around the base or crown trimming without having to do that for all the trees. So it helps you prioritize what needs the most protection, but still allowing you to implement prescribed fire and other beneficial land management techniques.
Well, it's certainly a wonderful paper, Kylie, and I want to thank you for coming on and talking about this in Fire Ecology Chats. Would you like to recognize any co-authors or funding agencies?
Yes, definitely. So first, I'd like to thank my co-authors, Frank Davis and Bruce Kendall, emeritus and current professors at the Brande School at UC Santa Barbara, who helped me complete this project as part of my doctoral work. Frank and I first came up with the ideas for the study through our time collecting data out in the woodlands at Sedgwick Reserve, which is part of the UC Natural Reserve System. So I'd also like to thank a mix of different funders. First, the Lacretz Research Center at Sedgwick Reserve for really hosting this project, Linda Dutton-Haver, the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation, and finally, Cal Fire Forest Health Program. Thank you so much to all of them for their generous support.
Well, thank you, and thank those funders, and thank your co-authors for a wonderful paper. You listeners, if you like this paper or would like to read it, guess what? I'll give it to you for free. Yes, you can download it for free from our website because Kylie has already paid the freight for it. So please, if you found this paper interesting, please download it. And if you don't like it, I'll be really, really amazed. And with that, please come and tune into the next Fire Ecology Chats.
Thank you for listening to Fire Ecology Chats, a podcast series by the Association for Fire Ecology. If you enjoyed this episode, subscribe to our show and leave us a review. To learn more about fire ecology and support our future work by becoming a member, visit fireecology.org. FIREECOLOGY.org.